"You need a wife, and I need a dad," the little girl told the huge cowboy. He slowly turned, and the single mother, standing nearby, burst into tears. Sable Ridge, Montana Territory. Autumn, 1877. Morning fog lay over the ridges, like a pale sheet thrown across the bones of the land. The pine trees stood tall and still, old guards watching a valley that had seen more blood than rain. Down below, thistles rattled in the breeze, while a lone horse moved through the grass with careful steps. Jackson Clay rode without hurry, the kind of slow that comes from having nowhere to be, or not caring if you ever arrive. He was big as a barn door, broad shoulders under a trail-worn coat, hat pulled low over eyes that had watched too much and said too little. The brown gelding beneath him moved with quiet respect, as if the horse knew this man liked things calm and quiet. Jackson followed no trail, only habit and memory. The faint smell of cedar smoke clung to him, like a ghost that refused to leave. Sable Ridge sat 5 miles to the west, but he only went there when his supply list grew longer than his need to avoid talk. He passed a pile of sun-baked rocks near a ravine when a sound cut the air, thin, shaky, human. A child's cry. Jackson hauled the reins. The gelding tossed its head and blew, ears twisting. Jackson swung down, his boots thudding into wet grass. The cry came again, weaker, echoing off stone. His heartbeat didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. The brush ahead was crushed flat. Beyond it, tucked behind a ring of stones, gaped a dry well with a rotten cover split in two. He knelt at the rim and looked down. His breath caught only a little. A small girl clung to the rough wall, mud streaked on her hands and knees. Her dress was torn at the hem. Brown curls stuck to her cheeks. She looked up, saw the dark shape leaning over the mouth of the well, and froze. Her eyes went wide with fear. Jackson didn't waste a word. He reached into his saddlebag, pulled a coil of rope, tied a clean loop, and dropped it with practiced aim. "Hold on," he said, voice rough as a scuffed boot. Her hand shook, but she caught the rope. Jackson braced against a stump and began to pull, slow and steady, like drawing up water you dare not spill. Halfway up she slipped, a thin scream ripping out of her. He grunted, tightened his hold, and bore down. Muscles bunched in his forearms, under the coat. His jaw set. Inch by inch, she rose until he could grab her under the arms and lift. She weighed almost nothing. He set her on the grass. For a moment, they didn't move. She was a mess, mud in her lashes, blood on her elbows, dirt in her hair. She coughed, wiped her mouth with a shaking hand, and then looked up at the man who had hauled her out of the dark. His face hid under the brim of his hat. A faint scar tugged at his left cheek. His big, rough hands hung at his sides. He didn't speak. He didn't reach. He just stood there while she stared at him like she was trying to see the person living under all that silence. Then her voice rose, hoarse and soft, almost like a little prayer. "You need a wife," she said. He blinked. She tilted her head and kept looking right at him. "And I need a dad." Jackson didn't move. Not when the breeze rustled the grass. Not when the gelding let out a low snort. Not when the cold morning air slid under his collar. But somewhere inside his chest, something shifted, a small crack, a quiet break, a forgotten beat. His weathered eyes, dry from years of dust and loss, grew wet. For the first time in a very long time, it wasn't the wind that did it. Later that morning, Sable Ridge rolled into view like an old memory. Leaning storefronts, tired wood, horses tied to crooked rails. The ring of the blacksmith's hammer rising and falling like the heartbeat of the West. Not much to look at, but to Mara Jennings it was far enough. She stood at the edge of Main Street, boots caked with dust, skirt torn from a long night ride. Her daughter, Ellie, had fallen asleep in the saddle hours back, tucked. against her mother's chest like a fragile prayer. Mara had not slept in days. She was 28, but heartache had added years to her face. No kind of rest could fix the weight she carried. Once smooth and sun-kissed, her face now held lines left by too many quiet moments, and nowhere safe to lay them down. Her eyes, icy blue and steady, scanned every shadow. They missed nothing. They trusted no one. Once she had been a field nurse, sewing up torn men in tents while the country tore itself in two. Her hands had stitched more flesh than they had held warmth. Her husband, Corporal Samuel Rains, had fallen at Spotsylvania, a good man with a gentle laugh. His death left her a widow, alone in a land that took and kept taking. After the war, she had nowhere to go. That's when Lyle Jennings stepped in. He had served with her husband. He offered a bed, then food, then protection. But protection came with a price: his hands, his temper, and the cruel idea that a person could be owned. No vows, no church, no promises, just bruises and silence. One night, Ellie cried in the next room. Mara looked into a broken mirror, touched the cut on her cheek, and chose to run. Now here she stood, Sable Ridge, a dot on a map, a breath of hope. She tied her horse in front of the mayor's office, pulled her shawl tight, and lifted sleepy Ellie into her arms. The child's weight steadied her as she stepped onto the creaking porch. Her heart pounded louder than any knock she might make. She never reached the door. Voices drifted from behind the building. One deep and rough, like wagon wheels over stone. The other, her daughter's. Mara stepped around the corner, and time stopped. Jackson Clay sat on the low back steps, still as carved oak, arms resting on his knees. Beside him, barely up to his elbow, Ellie looked up at his face and chattered, her little hand resting on his massive knee like it belonged there. The sight nearly split Mara in two. Jackson saw her first. He turned slowly, not startled, just aware. His eyes met hers across the yard. They were not cruel, not kind either. They were eyes that had survived. For a second, Mara forgot to breathe. Ellie turned, saw her mother, and ran. "Mama." Mara knelt and caught her, burying her face in those curls. When she looked up, Jackson had stood. He straightened to full height, hat in one hand, the other hanging like he didn't know where to put it. "Thank you for saving her," Mara said, voice no louder than a whisper. She could not hold his stare for long. I am her mother." Jackson gave one slow nod. No words. Only a steady presence, like a mountain that had decided to listen. In that moment, Mara Jennings, runaway widow, tired stranger, mother on the edge, felt something strange. For the first time in months, she did not feel afraid. In town, they called him Giant Clay. Not as a joke, but out of respect. The kind earned by keeping your mouth shut and doing what needs doing. Few knew his first name. Fewer still knew his story. He lived up on the ridge, past the split cedar trail in a cabin that leaned a little west, as if even the boards were tired of standing. Jackson had built that place with his own hands years back, when hope still had a pulse. Before the war, before the grave, he lived alone. No wife, no child, no dog, just a gray gelding, a hunting rifle, and a memory that refused to fade. Folks stopped asking questions after the first year. He showed up when a roof leaked or a wagon wheel broke, worked hard, spoke little, and slipped away before dark. A few remembered more. He had worn the blue once, Union artillery, a captain, decorated for skill with cannon, cursed for the way he shut down off the field. His men had called him the wall, couldn't be cracked under fire. None of that mattered after Shiloh Ridge, 2 months after Appomattox. Jackson took a short leave to surprise his wife and their little girl. They said the war was over, but the land still bled and justice had no compass. He came home to flames. The sheriff blamed a drunk militia who mistook his cabin for a rebel's. By the time Jackson reached it, his family was ash. He didn't scream. He didn't rage. He buried them under the dogwood and walked away, from the army, from the country, from life mostly. Until a little girl with muddy hands and a wildflower smile looked up at him from the bottom of a well. 2 days after he pulled Ellie out, Jackson found a handkerchief tucked beneath the gelding's saddle strap. White cloth with clumsy yellow petals stitched on daisies. He stared at it a long time. A child sewing. He should have returned it. He didn't. He folded it neatly and placed it in a tin under his bed beside an old tintype of a woman in a sun hat and a toddler barely walking. The next morning, before dawn, he rode into town. He didn't knock. He climbed onto the roof of the small cabin Mara rented and started prying up shingles. The leak was small, but winter would make it worse. He patched with care, checking each seam. When he finished, he left before anyone stirred. At sunrise, Mara opened the door and found a sack of oats on the step, fresh, heavy, tied with string. The next morning, flour, then dried apples. No note, no sound, just quiet deeds. Mara said nothing, but her eyes began to change. The frost blue softened at the edges. She watched the roof first with doubt, then with wonder. She left the porch lamp burning longer in the evenings. One afternoon, she caught sight of Jackson across the street. He tipped his hat a fraction. She gave a small nod. That night, as she mended the tear in Ellie's sleeve, she whispered, mostly to herself, "He doesn't talk, but he says plenty." Up on the ridge, Jackson sat by the fire and held the daisy handkerchief in his palm like it might bloom again. Market day comes to Sable Ridge once a month, if bustled, is what you call a place like this. Traders rolled in from far ranches with pelts, dried meat, herbs, and gossip that ran faster than any horse. Tables lined the dusty street, covered in burlap, bottles, and jars. Children wove through the crowd, sticky with candy and joy. Mara stood behind a small table with neat rows of hand-rolled bandages, tonics, and salves made from pine resin and willow bark. Her hands worked steady, arranging bottles, just so, but her eyes never stopped scanning. They never did. Ellie sat on a stool near the table, drawing lines in the dirt with a stick, glancing up every few seconds to check for her mother. The sun felt warm. The breeze was kind. For a brief moment, Mara let herself believe they were safe. Then the crowd shifted. A hush rolled in like a storm you smell before you see. Mara's body went rigid before she turned. Lyle Jennings stood there, hatlo, spurs ticking, a crooked grin on a sun-scorched face, 2 fingers hooked in his belt, close to the pistol riding his hip. "Well now," he said, voice sweet like spoiled molasses. "Ain't this a picture?" Mara grabbed for Ellie without thinking, pulling her close. Lyle took a step. "Been looking for you too." "I told you to leave us alone," Mara said. Her voice sounded flat, but fear trembled under it. "You told me plenty," he said, scanning the jars, the simple table, the small attempt at a new life. "None of it matters. You think sellin' bark water and bandages makes you free." Ellie whimpered and slipped away, not toward her mother, but toward the edge of the market, toward him. Jackson Clay stood near the leather goods stall, a lariat coiled in one hand, while he studied a worn bridle. He looked up just as Ellie crashed into his leg and buried herself behind him like she'd done it 1,000 times. His gaze rose over the crowd. Lyle had followed, 15 paces out. His hand twitched near his gun. Jackson turned fully, placing his body between the girl and the man. His bulk wiped out the sun. Lyle stopped. Jackson didn't speak. He didn't draw. He only looked. For a man like Lyle, used to shouting, fists, and fear, that look was worse than lead. The market went silent. Traders, children, horses, every living thing stilled. Mara pushed through bodies to reach Ellie, lungs burning, eyes wide. She made it to her daughters, sighed, just as Lyle took another step. Jackson raised his hand. Just one. It hung in the air like a falling mountain. Lyle hesitated. He looked into the face of the man they called Giant Clay. The rumors were true. Those eyes did not make threats. They carried certainty. Lyle's grin slipped. "Fine," he spat, backing away, shame and anger warring in his veins. "But she's still mine. You can't keep her forever." "No," Jackson said at last, voice low, like far-off thunder. "But I can keep you away." Lyle cursed, spun, and disappeared into the crowd. Silence hung for one last beat. Then sound rushed back in a wave, voices pretending they hadn't seen what they'd never forget. Mara dropped to her knees and gathered Ellie close. The little girl clung to her, but peered at Jackson with wide, thankful eyes. Jackson knelt too, pulled a clean handkerchief from his coat, and gently wiped the dirt and tears from Ellie's face. Then he stood and turned to Mara. Without a word, he reached into his saddlebag and took out a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. He handed it to her. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside lay Ellie's daisy-stitched handkerchief, washed, folded, pressed neat. "You kept it?" Mara asked, stunned. Jackson gave one slow nod. Her eyes filled. This time she didn't fight it. She let the tears fall. The ring of hammer on iron filled the dusk at the forge. Sparks jumped like angry fireflies. Old Jed Harlan, the blacksmith, paused when Jackson stepped into the shop. Jackson needed horseshoe nails. That was it. Jed squinted through heat and smoke, leaned closer, and frowned. "I know you," he said. Jackson laid a coin on the anvil and turned to go. "You wore blue," Jed said louder. "Shiloh. Gettysburg. You're Clay. Captain Jackson Clay of the 4th Artillery." The air went cold, colder than outside. Jackson didn't deny it. He walked out. The door creaked shut behind him, loud as a shot. By the time the hour had turned, the story had walked every porch, crossed every whiskey glass, and settled into every heart still haunted by the war. The fighting had ended more than 10 years ago, but the scars were fresh, and some still bled. It reached Mara by evening. She was sorting herbs at the small kitchen table when Mrs. Calhoun, the preacher's wife, slipped the news over the fence like a poison meant to help. By night, Mara sat beside the hearth in silence. Ellie slept in the next room, not knowing her mother's world had tilted again. Her husband had died in gray. The man who saved her child and chipped away the stone around her heart had worn blue. She did not sleep. At dawn, she climbed the trail to the ridge. Jackson was splitting wood. He saw her shape through the trees, straight-backed, stubborn, storm in her eyes. He wiped his hands, set the axe aside, and waited. "You fought for the North," Mara said. He nodded. "My husband died at Spotsylvania," she said. "Shot through the lung. Died choking on his blood." Jackson said nothing. He watched her the way a man watches lightning, never sure if it will burn or bless. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her voice shook. Jackson turned, walked into the cabin, and came back with a small battered wooden box. He held it out. She hesitated, then took it. Inside lay a tarnished Union officer's badge, and a folded letter with edges worn by time. "My wife's," he said. Mara opened the letter with trembling fingers. The ink had faded, but the script was careful and loving. "My dearest Jack, if you are reading this, I am gone. Do not chase the men who did this. Do not let vengeance take your life. I want you to live, my love. Live long enough to remember joy, to laugh again, to love again. Your heart is still soft as moonlight, no matter what blood it has seen." Mara folded the paper, hands shaking. Her throat closed. She looked at Jackson, and for a heartbeat she saw not a soldier, not a legend, but a man, a grieving man still breathing through ash. She closed the box and held it to her chest. Then memory returned like a wave. Samuel's laugh, his warm hands, the blood soaking her dress when she was handed his last letter. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I can't. Not yet." Jackson's face didn't fall. He only nodded, like he knew healing rarely arrives wrapped in kindness. It usually takes time. Mara stepped back, tears burning her eyes. "I have to protect my daughter from more ghosts, even gentle ones." She turned and walked down the trail. She did not look back. Jackson stood in the doorway, the box still warm from her touch, and watched her vanish into the fog. For the second time in his life, he let someone go. Night fell. The house was dark except for the weak lick of a lamp. Mara stood at the window, arms folded tight, staring at the packed saddlebags by the door. Her coat hung on a peg. Her heart was already halfway gone. Ellie sat on the bed, small hands clenched in the blanket. "Do we have to go?" she whispered. Mara didn't answer. "You said we'd stay if it was safe." "He made it safe." "I know," Mara said softly, forcing calm into her tone. "But sometimes it isn't that simple." "It is to me," Ellie said, nose running, eyes shiny. Mara knelt and hugged her. "Sleep. We ride at first light." Ellie nodded, but her eyes stayed open long after the lamp went dark, long after the quiet grew heavy. When she was sure her mother slept, Ellie slid from the bed, pulled on her boots, grabbed her small shawl, and slipped outside. The cold bit her cheeks and turned her breath to smoke, but she walked with purpose, arms wrapped around herself, tiny boots crunching frost. The trail to Jackson's cabin was longer in the dark. The trees looked like giants. She kept walking. She knew the way. Up on the ridge, Jackson stirred at a change in the wind. A sense, not a sound, pulled him from half-sleep. He rose, grabbed his rifle by habit, and moved to the door. He opened it. There, curled on the mat, lay Ellie. Lips blue, hands tucked under her chin, body shivering. Jackson dropped the rifle. In one quick motion he scooped her up, carried her inside, and set her on the cot by the fire. He stoked the embers, added 2 logs, and wrapped her in every blanket he owned. Her eyes fluttered. "I found you," she mumbled. He sat beside her, unsure how to fill the quiet. Words still felt strange in moments like this. "Why?" he asked. Ellie yawned. "Because you don't leave the people who hold you like you're precious." He swallowed and turned away. "I had a daughter," he said at last. The words scraped their way out. Her name was June. Ellie watched wide-eyed. She sang to the horses even when they were mean. "I wasn't afraid of much. Once she fell asleep in the hayloft, and I couldn't find her for hours. When I did, she just looked up and said, 'I was dreamin' of Cloud, Papa.'" His voice gave out. "That's enough," he said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Ellie slid a small hand into his rough fingers. "Did she know you loved her?" He nodded. "Every day." "Then she's still with you," Ellie said, snuggling deeper into the blankets. He didn't answer. He just sat there, firelight soft on a face that hadn't allowed itself to feel for a long time. At the edge of the porch, a shadow moved. Mara stood just outside the lantern glow, tears streaking her cheeks. She had woken to find Ellie gone and followed her tracks through the frost, heart thudding with fear. Through the window she saw him, the quiet giant bent over her child, speaking in a voice with more ache than anger, more love than loss. He hadn't seen Mara. She could have left. She didn't. She stayed, and, for the first time, she saw not the soldier or the badge, but the father he had been, and the man he could still be. The air turned too still. Jackson felt it first, an old instinct born from loss and war. The birds fell silent. Even the wind in the pines held its breath. He stepped onto the porch with a coffee mug, eyes narrowed toward the tree line. Something was coming. He went back inside and shut the door gently. Mara looked up from brushing Ellie's hair. The fire crackled. A pot simmered on the stove. "Go to the cellar," Jackson said, a calm voice with a steel edge. Mara stiffened. "Why?" He didn't explain. His eyes told her enough. He rolled back a rug and lifted the trapdoor. Mara took Ellie and climbed down. Jackson passed her a lantern and a rifle. "Don't come out," he said. "Not until I come for you." He closed the hatch and pulled the rug back in place. 10 minutes later, Lyle rode in. He wasn't alone. 2 hard-faced men came with him, armed to the teeth, mercenaries who killed for coins. The cabin stayed quiet as they dismounted. Lyle spat. "I warned you, Clay. Thought you could steal what's mine and walk away." Jackson stepped out of the trees, not the cabin. He'd circled around. A brittle branch cracked under his boot. He appeared with his rifle, hat low. "You get one chance," he said. "Turn around." Lyle laughed. "You're outgunned, old man." Jackson didn't answer, because he wasn't outsmarted. The first hired man moved forward and dropped screaming into a pit trap. Bone cracked. His gun skittered away. The second raised his rifle. A rope snapped. Logs rolled from the slope and slammed him into a tree. He didn't get back up. Only Lyle remained, furious and alone. He drew and fired. Jackson dove and rolled behind the water trough. A bullet tore a line across his arm, blooming blood. He fired back once and nicked Lyle's shoulder. The man howled and stumbled. Smoke drifted through the trees. Someone's cigar had kissed the dry brush. Fire crawled along the ground and climbed. Jackson limped forward, bleeding, rifle steady. Lyle crawled, hatred burning in his eyes. "She was mine," he hissed. "You don't take what's mine." "She was never yours," Jackson said. "She was surviving you." Lyle grabbed for his fallen gun. Jackson kicked away. Flames snapped to the pines. Jackson turned his back and walked off, leaving Lyle in the dirt. By the time townsfolk arrived, drawn by shots and smoke, the forest edge burned, but the cabin stood safe. In front of it, like a marker of ashen blood, stood Jackson Clay. Shirt ripped. One sleeve soaked red. Hat in his hand. Breath shallow. He did not fall. He stood between the fire and the home, between danger and the people inside. Mayor Calloway swung down from his horse, eyes wide. "My God, Jackson, what happened?" Jackson said nothing. He nodded toward the trees where Lyle lay and the mercenaries groaned. Behind him, the door hinges squeaked. Mara stepped out with Ellie in her arms. She looked at him, smoke curling behind his shoulders, chest heaving, blood staining his sleeve, and for the first time she saw not only the man who had saved them, but the man who had nearly died to do it, and still stood. Ellie lay bundled beneath quilts, cheeks flushed with fever, her hair damp against her forehead. Mara sat beside her, gently wiping away sweat with a cool cloth, whispering old lullabies, soft songs meant to soothe both mother and child. Jackson Clay sat close by, his chair pulled near the bed. He hadn't moved in hours. His tired eyes never left Ellie's face. The fire popped and hissed in the hearth, throwing long shadows across the wooden walls. Outside, the world held its breath, no wind, no crickets, just quiet, as if the land itself was waiting. Ellie stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open, then found them, her mother's tear-streaked face, and the rugged man beside her. She gave a weak smile. "Are we staying here forever?" she whispered. Jackson reached for her hand. It was small, but warm again, alive. He looked up at Mara. His voice was low and steady, like the rumble of a faraway storm. "Do I have your permission," he asked, "to build something that won't burn down this time?" Mara froze. Her breath caught, her lips trembling. Then she nodded, tears spilling over her cheeks. And for the first time, those tears weren't from fear or grief. They came from hope. 2 months later, spring spread its green fingers across the valley. The snow was gone. The river sang louder. Life returned. Jackson rebuilt his cabin from the ground up, not because it was ruined, but because he wanted to start clean. Every board was cut by hand, every beam sanded smooth. He fixed the roofline, widened the porch, and planted a small garden near the riverbank where the white birch trees reached for the sky. Mara filled the shelves with jars of herbs and worn books. She sang as she worked, soft hymns that floated out the open windows. Ellie laughed often now. She raced through the fields barefoot, her braids flying, climbed trees, and learned to ride a gentle mare Jackson had trained himself. Her laughter carried across the ridge, light and alive, until even the crows seemed to pause just to listen. They didn't talk about the past much. The war, the pain, the fire, they were still there, but quieter now, like ghosts who had finally learned how to rest. When the wild flowers bloomed, they married beneath the tallest birch in the valley. No preacher, no choir, just the mayor, smiling wide, hat in hand. The women of Sable Ridge had sewn Mara a simple white dress. It wasn't perfect, but it fit her like a promise. Jackson wore his cleanest shirt, pressed flat as he could manage. His big hands trembled as he buttoned the collar. Ellie stood between them, a daisy wreath on her head, petals in her pockets. She tossed them into the breeze, giggling as they drifted away. The ceremony was short, but the moment stretched forever. Jackson took Mara's hands. His rough voice softened as he spoke. "I thought I died in the war," he said. "I stopped breathing when the world burned down around me. But you and Ellie, you gave me air again. You gave me something to stay for. And this time, I'm not going anywhere." Mara pressed her forehead against his, whispering through her tears. "You gave us back the meaning of safety." Ellie squealed as they lifted her between them, their laughter mixing with the cheers from the few gathered townsfolk. There was no music, just hearts too full to stay still. The wind carried petals through the air like blessings. That evening, as the sun melted into gold, 3 horses rode across the open meadow, Jackson, Mara, and Ellie, side by side, no destination, no hurry. Their laughter rose above the steady beat of hooves, drifting away with the dust. Behind them, smoke curled lazily from the chimney of their small house by the river. The birch trees stood tall and white, their leaves whispering secrets to the wind. The little home glowed with warmth, not born from escape, but from a choice to stay. Sometimes, the heart doesn't find home where it began. It finds it where it decides to stop running. Jackson, Mara, and Ellie didn't just survive the Wild West. They built a life inside it. A quiet life. A strong one. Forged not from grand gestures, but from the simple, stubborn love of people who had lost everything and still chose to keep loving. Years later, travelers passing through Sable Ridge would sometimes see a big man working the fields by the river. They'd hear laughter from a porch, a woman's voice singing, a little girl's echoing giggle, a dog barking at the water's edge. Old-timers would nod and say, "That's Giant Clay's place." But those who stopped long enough to talk would learn the truth. He wasn't a giant because of his size or his silence. He was a giant because he stood between pain and the people he loved, and never stepped aside. When storms came, the cabin held. When seasons changed, the garden bloomed. And when the wind carried the sound of a child's laughter, it reminded everyone that even in a land built on loss, love could take root again. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video.